I was first exposed to Larry Osborne back in 1999 when I was just a wee little lad at Talbot School of Theology. Larry came as a guest presenter to my biblical leadership and management class, and I remember how impressed I was with him even back then. He was talking about this newfangled idea of sermon-based small groups, and I just sat back and went, man, this guy's really smart, and he's really practical. Larry has just done a tremendous job being a leader that we can really look to. He has written a ton of books, not the least of which Sticky Teams, Sticky Leaders, Sticky Church. In fact, he's got apparently, what I've heard, he's got a whole line of cookbooks coming out where he's going to be giving us recipes on sticky rice, sticky buns, sticky toffee. Be looking for that. But this book here I have is called Innovation's Dirty Little Secret. And actually, this book's kind of sticky too. I can't seem to get it off. Larry Osborne will stick to you, that's for sure. So I'm so privileged to welcome to you, to present to you, who I would call the godfather of EFCA West. Here he is, Mr. Larry Osborne.
This is Larry Osborne here over at North Coast Church, and we're still in a season of craziness. The word unprecedented is a way overused word, but when it comes to COVID-19 and what we've been going through, it's a very appropriate word. And I've been asked to share a few things about change and innovation as we come out of this and step into an unknown future. A number of years ago, I wrote a book called Innovation's Dirty Little Secret, kind of the crossover business version, or Sticky Leaders, pretty much the same book with a church viewpoint. And so if you're interested in these things and find them helpful, you might want to pick up Sticky Leaders and kind of work your way through it. But it is all surrounded around a principle that has always been true, pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, forever. It's the dirty little secret about change and innovation. And it's simply this: most innovations and most changes fail. Always have and always will. But the thing is, you and I go to a conference and they're not going to have the failure story up there. They're going to have the success story. And so unless a failure is spectacular or very close to home, we never hear about it. We only hear the success stories. But for everyone who sold everything they had, maxed out their credit cards, borrowed from their in-laws to plant a church or start a business and succeeded and is on the stage to tell you, there are 10 or 15 who failed and can't talk to their in-laws anymore. That's the truth, the dirty little truth that gets covered up in a culture that loves change agents and especially innovation. I think of, when we look at it from a Christian leader's perspective, I think of Acts chapter 16, where the Apostle Paul has prayed about and planned ahead of time this journey that he's going to take. He's probably printed up a bunch of magnetic prayer lists with the agenda for people to put on their refrigerators back home as he's heading off for Asia Minor, and then the Lord closes that door. Then he thinks Bithynia, the Lord closes that door. Then he has a pizza dream and feels like somebody's calling him from Macedonia. So and his buddies figure, well, that must be of the Lord. Then they go down to Macedonia. They get there, and they have to flee pretty much every city they go to as they're beaten and thrown into prison. And it's only way with 2020 hindsight, the rearview mirror, do we understand what God was up to. That God was setting him up with his number one funding source, a place called Philippi, was going to have books of the Bible that were written to us from the churches that were planted on this journey that he never intended to take. And when I look at a passage like that, I go, how is it that I sometimes, and you sometimes probably, can have the arrogance to think that we studied something enough, prayed about it enough, have a sense of peace from the Spirit, that we are absolutely sure we figured out what God's will is? You see, even for an Apostle Paul, things never seem to go exactly as he thought. And it's one of the keys that we need to keep in mind as we lead, really even in a certain future, but all the more into an uncertain future. So let me talk about, in particular, 5 things to keep in mind as we lead into an unknown future based on this fact that most of the innovations we come up with and most of the changes we try are frankly not going to make it. And the first one is this: God's will usually has both a what and a when. God's will has not only a what he wants us to do, but it has a when we're supposed to do it. And it's very important that we not confuse the two, because if we do, we could end up with 40 years in the desert that never had to happen. You want a biblical example of that? Just think of Moses. He knew he was to be their deliverer, but 40 years too early, he sees an Egyptian beating a fellow Jewish guy. He kills the Egyptian, he buries him, he thinks nobody sees it. The next day, a couple of fellow Jews are having a battle, and he tries to separate them. They go, well, are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? He goes, uh-oh, and he knows words out. And he flees to the wilderness and stays there 40 years until a burning bush says, okay, your assignment, your win is right now. Now, I've heard people say that, well, he needed to spend that time out in the wilderness and all this. That's not what the Bible says. It might make a good leadership talk, but the truth is, it says nothing about him needing to spend the time there. It says he went there because he jumped the gun. And as leaders, we have to make sure that we don't ever assume that once we know what to do, that means now is when to do it. You run into opposition, that might be not right now. You can't get a sense of unity among fellow leadership. You might know the what, but not the when. Understand God's will in uncertain times and even certain times has both a what and a when, and we need to get them both right to be in God's will. A second thing we need to remember in a day and age where we really value and put up risk takers, at least lucky fools who succeed, we need to know this. God's will has a what and a when, but also we should never confuse faith with risk. They are two completely different things. And we've come to the point often we talk about, well, we just need to have faith. And what we're actually saying is, well, we just need to go out on the limb. Faith biblically is not taking a risk. Faith biblically is doing what God told you to do. And he said, yeah, you can get out of the boat and walk on water. Then it's faith to walk on water. It's not faith to walk on water and expect God to hold me up. And one of the great mistakes that we as Christian leaders can make is confusing faith with risk. Faith is doing what God told you to do. Risk is expecting God to bail you out. Expecting God to bail you out when you did something he did not specifically tell you and me to do is presumption, not faith. And the scriptures have some pretty strong things to say about that. And once again, what happens? What gets the article written, the book written, what gets you on a stage? It's taking a crazy risk and being a lucky fool. But please, let's never assume that taking that risk was God honoring unless God told you to do that. And then any risk God told you specifically to take, that's not a risk. It's the most sure thing ever. Now there's a third thing that we need to know as we lead in uncertain times. And that is that our exit strategy is just as important as our implementation strategy. You see, I was taught as a leader to spend a whole lot of time thinking through all the things that could go wrong or right and laying out a game plan of what we're going to do. And I actually picked up the idea that if I also had an exit strategy, a point at which I said, I'm going to pull the ripcord if this happens, that I was moving into the situation with a lack of faith. Because if I had faith, I wouldn't expect to need to pull the ripcord. But if I have humility to understand the Apostle Paul could get it wrong, I could get it wrong, our team here at North Coast could get it wrong, then I'm going to have an exit strategy. And I'm going to know exactly at what altitude ahead of time I'm going to pull the ripcord. And if you haven't figured that out ahead of time on your new initiatives, on your changes and things you do, here's what I guarantee will happen. You're going to try just a little bit harder, just a little bit harder. You're going to wait just a little bit longer. You're going to pour some good money after bad. And then you're going to go, wow, this ain't working, and you pull the ripcord, and by then, the altitude's too low, and you're not going to make it. And I've seen that happen with leaders time after time. I've seen it in the business world with financial situations time after time. A couple of my best buddies are developers, and they taught me a phrase, if you chase a deal hard enough, it will catch you. They were simply saying in their own way, before they move into any real estate deal or look at it, they know at which point they're going to cut their losses and say, this brilliant idea in my head and on paper and in the office, once released in the wild, was not so brilliant. always have an exit strategy. One of the things about North Coast Church is we've been known as being innovative over the years. And what people don't realize is the number of failures we've had. And one of the reasons none of those failures were fatal was we always had an exit strategy figured out ahead of time. There was a time where we knew if this happens or doesn't go right, yeah, we're not liking the money or the time or the energy we lost, but we're pulling that ripcord. And therefore, because of that, we've lived to have another day. And that leads to the fourth of the things I want to share with you. Not only God's will as a what and a when, don't confuse faith and risk. Make sure your exit strategy is clear as implementation. And now number 4, when you lead, use the language of experimentation. Use the language of experimentation. Avoid the language of initiatives. What's the difference? The language of experimentation says, hey, we're going to try this. We're going to see how it works. Even when you know it's going to work, still use that phrase. Because what it does is it allows you a way out. And what happens more often when we're leading, especially when it's major change or major innovation, we oversell the idea. We try to get everybody convinced it's the greatest idea since flush toilets. And so what happens is we finally maybe get everybody aboard, and when it goes wrong, they're going to turn to you and your leadership team and go, man, you led us astray. The fact is we don't know what will work, and we don't know what won't work. And if we use the language of experimentation, we leave ourselves lots and lots of room to deal with the reality of the situation rather than the statements we made. Fact is, if you have lots of failed experiments and you're a scientist, you're a brilliant scientist. People talk all the time about Edison and all the failed experiments trying to come up with light, over 1,000 of them. And some guy in an interview asked him a question about that. And he said, no, I don't have 11,000 failures. I've found 11,000 ways that electricity won't create light. It won't work. He saw that as great success. And that's what experiments are. But initiatives, where a failed experiment makes you a great scientist, a failed initiative makes you a failed leader or a failed leadership team. Frankly, you can't have very many of them. And if you were to go back and watch the language at North Coast Church, when we started video venues, when we started sermon-based small groups, long ago when sharing the pulpit, some things that were just frankly not done at that time and got a lot of negative pushback, one of the keys that gave us the ability to do that was this language of experimentation. Because I want you to catch this. The language of we're going to try something not only gives you cover if it fails, and most of the time good ideas fail, but it also gets you permission much quicker. You see, if I'm trying to convince everybody this is an initiative, it will absolutely work, before they're going to sign off on it, they want to know and be convinced it's absolutely going to work. But if you just want to try something, you want to experiment, most everybody is going to step back and they don't mind watching the train wreck as long as their name's not on it, their money's not in it. So it will not only protect you from the failure, it will get you there so much quicker because everybody will let you try something that they will not necessarily sign off and buy into. And number 5, the last of these things, is make sure you always leave room for mid-course corrections. And I believe the way to do that is if you lead with direction instead of goals and metrics. A lot of us have been taught to lead with goals and metrics. We think that's the thing that pulls us into the future. But the problem with clear goals and clear metrics, you can see it in the stock market, publicly traded companies. You can see it in lots of areas. We manipulate things to hit that goal. We manipulate things to hit it at the right time frame. A directional leadership says we're going towards this mountain, but like Lewis and Clark, we don't know what the winter's going to bring. Your people need to know where you're headed. Crystal clear direction. We are doing this. But exactly when and how? You see, Paul's direction in Acts 16, where we started today, was we're going to go visit churches that we help plant and encourage them. And our direction is we are all about planting churches. And so when God made mid-course corrections and he went places there were no churches, he still was heading in the same direction, the direction of we are making and building up churches. And that mid-course correction led to incredible, incredible fruit. That will be true in your life if you're directional. And if you're too tied into clear and rigid goals and metrics, you're either going to miss them, you're going to make them so low that they're easy to pass anyway, or worse of all cases, you're going to manipulate reality so you can say you achieved the goal. Back to Lewis and Clark. They were searching for a Northwest Passage. You realize it didn't exist, but they got to the Pacific. And along the way, they learned incredible lessons. And though they had loss of life and some incredible loss and incredible hardships, think how many more lives would have been lost, how much more hardship if they'd had a calendar and every single day had been marked out how far they were supposed to go. Nope. Life is not, and leadership is not a blueprint with every detail spelled out. It's a game plan in which there's a constant mid-course correction based on this thing we call the scoreboard. Keep these 5 things in mind, and I believe that you will be able to lead more effectively and with greater fruit as we plow our way out of this into the next unknown future.
Hey, what a great blessing that was. There was so much knowledge packed into that 15 minutes. If there's one quote that I walked away with, it's this: life is not, and leadership is not, a blueprint where every detail is spelled out. It is a game plan where there is constant mid-course correction. And that is something that we can take great courage and encouragement in as we continue to move forward. Don't expect to have all the details, but stay faithful in all that you do. And sticky book.